Hello and welcome back. Today we will cover Alma 52 through 55. These are some of what people call the war chapters of the Book of Mormon. If you're interested in a possible theory on the purpose of the war chapters and the other non-doctrinal content in the Book of Mormon, follow the link in the top corner of your screen. We'll start by answering the trivia question from last time. What happened in the Book of Mormon on New Year's Day? You may remember that the last video ended with Teancum assassinating Amalickiah and then returning to camp and waking up his soldiers. So now we continue with Alma 52:1. And now it came to pass in the 26th year, the reign of the judges over the people of Nephi, behold, when the Lamanites awoke on the first morning of the first month, behold, they found Amalickiah was dead in his own tent. And they also saw that Teancum was ready to give them battle on that day. So the first morning of the first month. Basically, it was New Year's Day, and Amalickiah was discovered dead in his tent. And that timestamp gives us an opportunity to discuss Nephite geography because it allows us to see how much can happen in a calendar year. After Amalickiah died, his brother Ammoron succeeded him as the Lamanite king. Verse 12 says, Ammoron had departed out of the land of Zarahemla and had made known unto the queen concerning the death of his brother. From that phrase, it's not clear whether he left the land northward that belonged to the Nephites, which was sometimes called Zarahemla, or whether he was living in the capital city of Zarahemla. But once he became king, he didn't stay in the land northward. And as king, he did two things. First, he told his army on the eastern shore to maintain the cities that they had captured, and second, he traveled south from Zarahemla to the land of the Lamanites. When he arrived, he informed the Lamanite queen of Amalickiah's death. Then he gathered a large force of men and attacked the Nephite cities near the shores of the West Sea. This incident to me emphasizes how geographically small the land of the Nephites was. Amalickiah was killed in the very northeast corner of the Nephite lands at the beginning of the 26th year. From there, word traveled until it reached Ammoron. Ammoron traveled south to the land of the Lamanites and informed the queen of her husband Amalickiah's death. Then he gathered a large army and marched with them to the southwest corner of the Nephite nation. And he did all of this by the end of the 26th year. If you picture the land of the Nephites as spanning thousands of miles, that's simply not realistic. Although it may be possible to travel thousands of miles on foot in a year, Ammoron also needed time, presumably a lot of time, to gather soldiers for the army, and then he needed more time to travel with them. The next year, in the 27th year, Captain Moroni made a similar journey. At the beginning of the 27th year, Moroni's army was establishing defenses along the southern and western borders of the land. Then, when Moroni heard that Teancum needed help near the land of Bountiful, he began his march with his men, arriving at the northeastern border near the latter end of the year. Anyway, in my opinion, most speculative maps of Nephite geography are much too big. The Holy Lands of the Bible, in their entirety, are only about 150 miles long and 50 miles wide. And, in my opinion, based on what we read about Ammoron, the Nephite nation could not have been much bigger than that. And it's completely unimportant doctrinally, but it still irks me a little bit when people suggest that the Nephite nation was thousands of miles across. Okay, now we return to Alma 52. When Amalickiah's body was discovered the following morning, on the first day of the 26th year, with Teancum's army standing ready for battle, the Lamanites retreated to the recently conquered city of Mulek. Word of Amalickiah's death reached Amalickiah's brother Ammoron, who was in Zarahemla. He departed to the Lamanite country, as we discussed above, and left instructions for the Lamanites to maintain the fortified cities that they had captured along the eastern seashore. When Teancum saw that the Lamanites were planning to stay and defend their captured cities, he decided not to attack them because the Lamanite army was too big, and it was now inside the fortified cities that Moroni had designed. So instead, Teancum continued strengthening the fortifications of the Nephite cities that they still held, and he kept his forces near the Lamanite army as though he were preparing an attack. Moroni sent a large group of men to reinforce Teancum's army, as well as some instructions. First, he told Teancum to keep any captured Lamanites as prisoners. The Lamanites had been taking Nephites prisoners, and Moroni hoped to be able to make a prisoner exchange with them. Next, he told Teancum to reinforce the city of Bountiful and to secure the narrow gap between the east and the west seas, which came close together near the land of Bountiful, or the Lamanites might be able to go through this gap and then attack them from the north. And finally, he instructed Teancum to remain in the land along the eastern seashore and, quote, seek every opportunity to scourge the Lamanites in that quarter, the goal being to eventually retake the cities that had been captured by the Lamanites. Meanwhile, as we said, Ammoron, the recently appointed king of the Lamanites, left Zarahemla and began gathering an army to attack the cities on the western borders of the Nephite lands. His intent was to require the Nephites to defend two fronts on opposite sides of the country. And even though Teancum received orders to attack the city of Mulek, he was badly outnumbered and chose to wait for Moroni's help. Moroni arrived with reinforcements towards the end of the 27th year. Shortly thereafter, early in the 28th year, Moroni, Teancum, and several chief captains held a war council to discuss how to lure the Lamanites out of these fortified cities that they were occupying. They sent messages to the leader of the Lamanites at Mulek, who was a man named Jacob, asking him to come out and meet them in battle on the plains, but he refused. So Moroni proposed a little bit of trickery. Late one night, he moved his army to the west of Mulek, and he sent Teancum with a very small group of men to walk by Mulek along the seashore, so that when the sun came up, the Lamanite guards would see him walking near the city. And sure enough, when the sun came up, the Lamanites saw Teancum, and they, quote, ran and told it unto Jacob their leader. Jacob responded by mobilizing the entire Lamanite army and sending them in pursuit of Teancum. Why was Jacob so eager to capture or kill Teancum? Maybe they knew that Teancum was Amalekite's assassin, or maybe Ammoron had put a price on his head, or maybe they just knew that he was a feared Nephite warrior, or maybe he was just an easy victim and he was a Nephite. But in any case, the discovery of Teancum and the smallness of his number was enough to empty the army out of the city in pursuit. And when Teancum saw that the entire Lamanite army was chasing him, he fled northward along the seashore in the direction of Bountiful. And once the Lamanite forces had left Mulek, Moroni sent part of his army to seize the city, and the rest of his army went chasing after the Lamanites. Teancum had nearly reached the city of Bountiful with the Lamanite army in hot pursuit when he, quote, met Lehi and a small army. And if there was one man in the Nephite army that the Lamanites feared, it was Lehi, as we discussed in a couple of the previous videos. The appearance of Lehi's force put the tired Lamanites into a panic, even though they had them badly outnumbered, and they started to retreat toward Mulek. But they had barely begun their retreat when they met Moroni's army, who had been following them. Moroni commanded his men to attack, but to accept surrender if their enemies threw down their weapons. But Jacob, the Lamanite leader, it says, was a Zoramite with an unconquerable spirit, and he was hoping to destroy Moroni's army and then continue and regain Mulek. Both sides fought desperately. Jacob was killed, Moroni was injured, and then Lehi caught up with him. Verse 36, and Lehi pressed upon their rear with such fury with his strong men that the Lamanites in the rear delivered up their weapons of war, and the remainder of them, being much confused, knew not whither to go or to strike. It's unclear whether Lehi's men killed anyone, or if the rearmost Lamanites were so terrified by their approach that they threw down their weapons. But anyway, Between Jacob's death and Lehi's arrival, the Lamanites panicked, and their chief captains and most of the army surrendered their weapons, so Moroni took that entire army prisoner. While the Lamanite prisoners buried the dead from the battle, Moroni took Lehi back to Mulek and put him in charge of the city. After the dead were buried, Moroni took all of the prisoners north to Bountiful, which became the city where Lamanite POWs were kept. Mormon, the narrator, explained that the Nephites kept their prisoners busy because it was easier to guard them while they worked. They primarily worked on reinforcing the city's battlements, deepening the ditch around the city, and using dirt and timber to raise the wall, and this city became an exceeding stronghold ever after. With the prisoners busy, Moroni turned his attention to providing food both for the men in his army and the women and children that these men had left behind. But while Moroni was helping Teancum up north, the Lamanites took advantage of their absence, and they were able to take several cities along the south near the West Sea. Mormon says this was because of some intrigue among the Nephites. This was dangerous for the Nephites because they were now fighting the Lamanites on two fronts. Mormon then shifted his focus to the people of Ammon. These were the Lamanites who were converted by Ammon and his brothers. In Alma chapter 24, this group had taken an oath to never again take up weapons against their enemies, and they were given land to peacefully live in among the Nephites, where they could be protected. But when they saw the danger that the Nephites were in, they wanted to take up arms and help defend their country. Verse 14, "But behold, as they were about to take their weapons of war, they were overpowered by the persuasions of Helaman and his brethren, for they were about to break the oath which they had made." Roughly 15 years had passed since the oath was taken, and the Lamanites had many adolescent sons who had not taken the covenant of peace, being too young at the time. These young men, of which there were about 2,000, also took an oath, but their oath was not an oath of peace. Verse 17, "And they entered into a covenant to fight for the liberty of the Nephites, yea, to protect the land under the laying down of their lives. Yea, even they covenanted that they would never give up their liberty, but they would fight in all cases to protect the Nephites and themselves from bondage." Mormon, the narrator, described the nature of these young men. "And they were all young men, and they were exceedingly valiant for courage, and also for strength and activity. But behold, this was not all. They were men who were true at all times in whatsoever thing they were entrusted. Yea, they were men of truth and soberness, for they had been taught to keep the commandments of God and walk uprightly before him." There's some question about their age. They are referred to as Helaman's 2,000 stripling soldiers. And the word stripling means youth or adolescent. At the time of Joseph Smith's translation, the definition was a young man in the state of adolescence, or just passing from boyhood to manhood, a lad. So these were not powerful warriors. They were adolescents who were still young and were still growing. Helaman, who was a religious man rather than a military leader, led this band of 2,000 young men to support the people on the western borders of the nation, southward by the West Sea, at the end of the 28th year. And then we move to Alma chapter 54. In the beginning of this 29th year, Ammoron proposed an exchange of prisoners with Moroni. Moroni rejoiced at this proposal. In addition to freeing the families being held captive by the Lamanites, he could stop feeding and guarding Lamanite prisoners, making more food available for his own people, and making more soldiers available for his army. After receiving Ammoron's message, Moroni wrote an epistle and had Ammoron's messenger take it back with him. He agreed to exchange prisoners with the Lamanites, exchanging one Lamanite warrior for one Nephite family. Remember that Moroni was in the northeast corner of the Nephite nation, and Ammoron was down in the southwest corner. Ammoron's messenger crossed the Nephite nation twice, once in each direction, in a comparatively short amount of time. Again, this highlights how small the Nephite nation was. When Mormon was writing his book, which is what we're now reading, he included both of Moroni's epistles to Ammoron and also Ammoron's response in their entirety. Moroni knew that Ammoron was a fraud and a contemptible human being, and he let him know it. Amalickiah had lived among the Nephites, but after failing to be voted king, he joined the Lamanites, became their king, and brought an army to kill the Nephites who had voted against him. And Ammoron had continued living among the Nephites until Amalickiah was killed, and then he traveled to the land of Lamanites to become the next king. Moroni said that if Ammoron did not agree to the terms of his exchange, that he would not simply defend himself against Lamanite attacks, as they had historically done, but he would invade the Lamanite lands, arming even his women and children if needed. He reminded Ammoron of the hell that awaited murderers such as Ammoron and his brother Amalickiah. Moroni's letter made Ammoron angry, and he responded. In his letter, he repeated the false accusation that the Lamanites had historically made against the Nephites, which was that the Nephites should have been subject to the Lamanites because Laman had been Nephites' older brother. Ammoron ignored Moroni's threat, and he agreed to exchange prisoners with them so that he could have more resources available to attack the Nephites. Here's verse 20. Nevertheless, I will grant to exchange prisoners according to your request gladly, that I may preserve my food for my men of war, and we will wage a war which shall be eternal, either to the subjecting of the Nephites to our authority, or to their eternal extinction. He closed his letter claiming to be a bold Lamanite, waging war to avenge the wrongs of the Nephites against the Lamanites. Now let's pause for a minute. Mormon was writing the history of his people, and he was doing it as a disciple of Jesus Christ, painstakingly inscribing his record onto metal plates. Several times he said there's not room for even 100th part of what he could include, but yet he took time to include both of Captain Moroni's letters in their entirety. Why did he choose to do that? How are we better for having read them? It's worth thinking about. Now we're on to Alma chapter 55. When Moroni read Ammoron's letter, in which he claimed to be waging a war to avenge Nephite injustices against the Lamanites, he knew that Ammoron was just trolling him. And so he refused to exchange prisoners unless Ammoron would, quote, withdraw his purpose. He also refused to make an exchange that would give his enemies, the Lamanites, additional power or resources. So instead of exchanging prisoners, he decided to go on the offensive. In Moroni's own words, I will seek death among them until they shall sue for peace. The three most northern cities along the eastern sea were, from north to south, Bountiful, Mulek, and Gid. Bountiful was where Moroni was keeping the Lamanite prisoners. Mulek was the city that they had just barely retaken and where Lehi was stationed. Gid, on the south, was the city where the Nephite prisoners were at. And Moroni thought of a strategy to set them free. But his plan or his strategy required the help of someone who looked like a Lamanite. So he searched among his men, and he found an actual Lamanite, named Laman even. Laman had been present when Amalickiah had assassinated the old Lamanite king. And when Amalickiah framed him and the other servants for the murder of the king, they fled north and joined the Nephites. I find it kind of interesting that he chose to enlist in the army, maybe because he knew firsthand that Amalickiah was an evil and a murderous man, having witnessed him kill the old Lamanite king. So this Laman, under Moroni's direction, approached the city of Gid pretending to be an escaped Lamanite prisoner who had not only escaped but had fled to the city of Gid for protection, bringing a lot of Nephite wine with him. He was welcomed by the city's guards, who eagerly got drunk on the wine, which had, quote, been prepared in its strength. Before long, the guards were senseless, and Laman and his men fled back to Moroni, reporting that they had succeeded. With all of the guards either asleep or drunk, Moroni's army threw weapons to the Nephite prisoners inside the city walls. This was done in complete silence somehow, presumably to avoid waking the other Lamanites who were simply asleep rather than drunk. It would have been easier for Moroni's armies to simply kill everybody in the city while they were asleep, but Moroni wanted to avoid bloodshed whenever possible. When morning came, the Lamanites found themselves trapped between armed Nephite prisoners within the city and a Nephite army outside the city. So they immediately surrendered their weapons and were escorted north and were added to the prisoners in the city of Bountiful. In the final verses of the chapter, the narrator says that the Lamanites tried to use some of Moroni's tactics against them. When they encircled the Nephite cities by night, as Moroni had done, they did lose many prisoners. And there were also a few times when the Lamanites sent wine to the Nephites, hoping to either poison them or to get them drunk. But any Lamanite wine that came over was tested on Lamanite prisoners before the Nephites would even touch it. Now, the next city in line, continuing south down the seashore, after Gid, was the captured city of Morianton. Lamanites in this city frequently received provisions and reinforcements, and they had fortified this city until it became an exceeding stronghold, and thus ended the 29th year. And that's also where we're going to end today's discussion. Normally, I would have a trivia question now, but I'm planning to try something new. Instead of ending with the trivia question and answering it in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'll ask a trivia question at the beginning of the video and answer it at the end. And we will see you next time.